It's a Michigan.
What a simple statement. Difficulties are just things to overcome, after all. But behind that brief observation is a complex set of ideas, suggesting that with perseverance, most anything can be accomplished. That statement could certainly be applied to hunting for long-lost shipwrecks. It is a difficult task to piece together century-old clues, assemble the resources and technology, and spend the time necessary to make a discovery. Many things must be overcome, from historical inaccuracies to weather constraints and equipment malfunctions. Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates face these difficulties in their pursuit of the shipwreck SS Michigan. But after 3 years of planning, 50 square miles of coverage, and some good old-fashioned luck, their goal was achieved. The final resting place of the Michigan had been found. These simple words take on even more meaning when attributed to the person who said them. Difficulties are just things to overcome, after all, was what Ernest Shackleton humbly declared soon after returning from nearly 2 years stranded in the frozen Antarctica. How prophetic that Shackleton's ship was called Endurance. In December 1914, Ernest Shackleton and a crew of 27 set out on a 3-masted schooner to attempt to be the first humans to cross the South Polar Continent. After 11 months, they became hopelessly trapped by the pack ice and abandoned their damaged ship to proceed on foot. 1 month later, after they left the Endurance, increased pressure from the ice splintered the hull and sent it to the bottom in thousands of feet of water. It would be more than 6 months later, after living on the ice floes, that the small group led by Shackleton overcame nearly insurmountable obstacles to bring the crew safely home. As familiar as we have become with this epic voyage through several books and a feature film, many of us did not realize that a similar epic played out 30 years earlier in Lake Michigan. In 1885, the 200-foot steamer SS Michigan, with its sturdy steel hull, headed north out of Grand Haven to attempt to rescue the Oneida, which had become trapped in the ice during the most brutal winter then recorded. A storm hit, blew the Michigan south, and trapped the ship hopelessly in the pack ice. The rescuer now became the victim. After 40 days, the crew was forced to take to the ice as their vessel was slowly crushed and finally sank to the bottom. It would be several days later, after trudging across the ice-encrusted lake, that all 30 men finally reached shore in this local story of endurance. Until the turn of the 21st century, both the Endurance and the Michigan lay forgotten in their watery graves. The Endurance rests thousands of feet under the frigid Antarctic waters, and the Michigan rests hundreds of feet under Lake Michigan. Neither ship carried anything of monetary value. The treasure in both these ships is an historical one, that they represent the perseverance, stamina, and heroism of crews who remind us of what can be accomplished when you set your mind to it. In 2001, Dr. Robert Ballard, famous for leading the expeditions to find the Titanic and the Bismarck, considered a project to attempt to locate the remains of the Endurance, but had difficulty funding the endeavor. On his heels, David Mearns of Blue Water Recoveries, whose organization recently located the wreck of the HMS Hood, is proposing a similar project. Considering the complexity of the undertaking, the enormous costs and limited time frame to conduct such a search in Antarctica, it is no wonder that these searchers have not yet mounted an expedition. Halfway around the world, on a much smaller scale, Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates, fresh from their discovery of the H.C. Akeley in 2001, began considering an expedition to locate the SS Michigan.
While there's several shipwrecks out there the MSRA is interested in looking for, the Michigan appeared to be the easiest to find just because of the amount of information available about her, the numerous newspaper accounts as she was frozen in the ice and traveled up the coast. we put our heads together and thought, this is probably the best information we have on a shipwreck. This is the one we should go after because it'll be the easiest to find.
Built as a sister ship to the SS Wisconsin by the Detroit Dry Dock for the Goodrich Transportation Company, the SS Michigan was a sturdy iron hull passenger steamer. Goodrich had ordered 3 ships built in 1881, the 2 propellers and a sidewheeler named the SS City of Milwaukee. The 3 vessels were designed by Frank E. Kirby, the same man who designed the ill-fated Chicora a decade later. The Michigan was 204 feet long, 35 feet wide, and had a draft of 12 feet. With 5 watertight compartments and a double hull, the Michigan was considered a very sturdy vessel. She was launched August 20th, 1881 in Wyandotte, Michigan, and towed to Milwaukee for fitting out. Her cabins were said to be the finest on the lakes. They were decorated without regard to cost, with the finest velvet carpets, walnut furniture, and oil paintings. Accommodating 123 passengers, the cabins extended the length of the vessel and were more spacious than usual. The Wisconsin, Michigan, and City of Milwaukee operated successfully for the Goodrich Line for 2 years, but were then sold in May of 1883 to the Detroit, Grand Haven, and Milwaukee Railroad Company, and continued the next 2 years in their trade.
Well, when most ships sink, we have a debris field, debris that washes to shore, and we have witnesses that see it wash ashore, and we can try to track that back to where the ship may have sank. In the case of the SS Michigan, a totally different story. We had no debris. We had a ship that sank in the ice after being trapped for over 40 days. The captain actually walked away and watched his ship sink. But we do have the captain's eyewitness report, and we have newspaper accounts, but that's all we had to work with.
The early winter of 1885 had been especially harsh, but by the first week of February, the weather had become rather mild. Folks in West Michigan thought the worst of winter was over. Taking advantage of the weather, the steamship Oneida, also owned by the Detroit, Grand Haven, and Milwaukee Railroad Company, was sent out across the lake for a regular cargo run. But Monday, February 9 brought the worst storm in a decade. More than 3 feet of snow fell in 2 days. The severe weather, oddly enough, was attributed to a volcanic eruption on the other side of the world. In August 1883, Mount Krakatoa in Indonesia erupted, killing 30,000 people and sending a plume of ash into the atmosphere. 18 months later, the world was still feeling the effects of one of the mightiest volcanic eruptions ever. In the Midwest, temperatures were averaging 10 to 20 degrees below zero, and on Lake Michigan, dozens of ships were trapped by the rapidly forming ice along the eastern shore of the Big Lake. The Oneida was one of those ships. Seen from shore, stuck fast in the ice off Ludington, her situation appeared hopeless. Owners of the Detroit, Grand Haven, and Milwaukee Railroad Company called the captain and crew of the Michigan back to duty to aid the trapped Oneida. They were convinced that the Michigan's double iron hull could break the ice around the Oneida, setting her free to steam back to port. The captain, 58-year-old Redmond Prindeville, the father of 13 children, was an Irish immigrant, born at Castle Island on the west coast of Ireland in 1826. On Monday, February 9, 1885, the SS Michigan left its winter port of Grand Haven, Michigan, with Captain Redmond Prindeville and 29 men aboard. The first leg of the journey was clear steaming as Captain Prindeville and his crew eased the steamer into Lake Michigan. The Oneida was last reported 10 miles off Point Sabo, so the Michigan headed out a good distance, then turned starboard and steamed to the north. It was a clear day with no indication of the storm to come. The temperature was well below freezing, so even with steam heat inside the vessel, it would have been frigid in the pilot house. Down below, the ship's engineer and crew kept the boilers stoked. There was plenty of coal to handle the round trip and any problems they might incur while attempting to free the Oneida. The powerful engines were kept at peak performance, and the Michigan was making good time. Shipboard life was normal in every way. In the galley, the cook was busily preparing the first meal of the trip. It's not known how long the Michigan steamed northward, cutting through the thin, patchy ice, but she must have been about 20 miles out and heading north when the weather turned. She may have even reached Pentwater, possibly near enough to the trapped Oneida to begin breaking through the ice. But the historical accounts tell us that before the Oneida could be reached, a fierce winter storm moved in. Soon, a Great Lakes nor'easter hit, pushing the Michigan in the opposite direction, southward into the ever-building ice pack. After the storm abated, an official from the Detroit, Grand Haven, and Milwaukee Railroad headed north to Pentwater in an attempt to locate his missing vessels, the Oneida, the Wisconsin, and the Michigan, but none of the vessels was visible from shore. 2 days after the Michigan left port, Lake Michigan was completely frozen over, something that had not happened since 1874. Overnight, the Michigan was covered with snow and hopelessly locked in solid ice. She began drifting southward with the ice pack as the pressure began to build on her sturdy steel hull. Days later, she was more than 40 miles south of where she was when the storm first hit. While the engines were still running, the ship was at the mercy of the ice. The Michigan had become hopelessly trapped as the lake iced over. It was clear to Captain Prindeville that his ship would not be able to break free. But the crew kept a steady watch for an open patch of water, even as the ice tightened its grip on the ill-fated vessel. It looked like the crew of the Michigan would not be returning home soon. To fully assess their situation, the crew lowered a rope to check out the conditions on the ice. It was a very odd perspective for the crew to view their magnificent ship as they walked around her. The ship towered above them as they made their inspection of the hull. Crew members were roped together in case the ice gave way during the inspection. Their situation was hopeless. There was no way to break through the thick pack ice, even with her strong engine and iron-clad hull. The men returned to the ship to report the news, with confirmation that they were solidly entrenched in the ice and that pressure was building on the hull. The men reported the distressing news to the captain. So with nothing to do but wait for the weather to change, the crew busied themselves with their daily duties. The engineers secured the equipment and kept the steam in the boilers up to generate heat on board the vessel. The ship's coal bunkers had plenty of fuel, so staying reasonably warm was not a problem. The ship's officers went about their daily chores, hoping they would soon return to active duty. Meals were all the crew had to look forward to, but the ship was not provisioned for a long voyage, and supplies would run out if the weather didn't break soon. Within a week, the crew was down to 1 meal per day. After more than a week, the situation for the Michigan crew remained unchanged. The ship was still solidly locked in the ice. With no relief in sight, and with 13 men needed to run the ship once she was free of the ice, Captain Redmond Prindeville chose 17 of the hardiest men to make the long walk to shore, since there was not enough food for all of them. Among these was the ship's young porter, George Sheldon, who promised Captain Prindeville that if he survived the trip to shore, he would return as soon as possible with news from shore and much-needed supplies. The crew members left the Michigan on the 17th. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero as the party, armed with axes, pikes, ropes, and rations, began their trek at 7 a.m. First Mate Joseph Russell led the group, comprised of 16 other crew members, including George Sheldon. With nothing but a compass to lead them in the direction of the land they could not see, the band of survivors continued marching east for the better part of the day. It was hard going, trudging through the deep snow and jagged ridges of ice. The arduous trip was complicated further by the ship's clerk, W.D. Kenny, who had fallen through the ice on the trip and whose legs were nearly frozen. He finally gave up as he fell down a ridge of ice and had to be carried much of the way by First Mate Russell and others. After 10 long hours exposed to the worst winter weather in a decade, the crew was finally able to see shore, but it was a long way off. Near day's end, at about 5 p.m., they finally reached shore somewhere in West Casco Township of Allegan County. The half-frozen crew had covered over 12 miles in 10 hours on their hike from the Michigan to shore, only to face one last remaining obstacle before they could rest. The only possible way to reach a cottage or a farm for food and shelter would be to climb the steep bluff. After their trek across the ice, this seemed an insurmountable task. They had all they could do to struggle up the rocky, snow and ice-covered hill. Once they reached the top, they knew they had found safety. Nearby, they could see a small farmhouse with smoke coming from the chimney. Someone was home. Imagine the surprise of Levi Thomas when these nearly frozen sailors showed up at his door. But he was quick to offer them shelter and food. George Sheldon and one other crewman were housed overnight by Levi Thomas and his family. They warmed themselves by the fire and shared their fantastic story. And what a story it was. The remaining crew members were housed by nearby families for the night, and the following morning, Wednesday the 18th, all 17 men were taken by sleigh to the train station at Bravo, Michigan, for their trip north to Grand Haven and home, where their journey had begun 9 days earlier. Meanwhile, back on board the Michigan, Captain Prindeville and the 12 remaining crew members really did not have much to do except to pass the time. Food and fuel were becoming scarce, so they stayed together in one area of the ship to conserve heat. Music helped pass the long, cold, lonely hours. For 3 days they waited, not knowing if their fellow crewmen had even made it to shore, or whether George Sheldon would return as he promised. A close watch was kept on the eastern horizon for any sign of movement. And finally, on Saturday the 21st, their patience was rewarded as they spotted someone approaching the ship. It was George Sheldon. He had returned. It was a joyous moment for the crew, who until now were not sure that anyone on shore even knew they were alive. After another day-long walk, the young porter had made it back with much-needed supplies, sure to raise the crew's spirits. He brought them news from home, letters from family members, books, tobacco, and even a few bottles of whiskey. For a crew who'd been trapped in the ice for 2 weeks, it was like Christmas morning. For Sheldon, it was time to get some rest. He looked forward to a little relaxation in the crew's quarters, and more importantly, turning in early for a good night's sleep. But 2 days later, this hardy young man, with a bag packed with letters from the crew to their family members back home, and a dispatch from the captain to his superiors, again set out across the ice for shore. And once again, he promised Captain Prindeville that he would return. Having already made the walk twice, Sheldon had become familiar with his path, but the ever-changing ice made for some complications. Still, he was able to make the trip to shore in just 5 hours this time. Upon reaching West Casco, Michigan, he again journeyed north to Grand Haven by train, delivering his letters and packages. Then on Wednesday, the 25th, aided by 6 of his newfound friends from Casco, George Sheldon again made the 12 to 15-mile hike out to the stranded vessel, bringing even more food and supplies. The Casco men had planned to return to home the next day, but the weather suddenly took a turn for the worse, and George Sheldon and his Casco friends would not be able to leave the Michigan. The Casco men had unwillingly joined the stranded crew. In the distance, the ice was beginning to run, and the captain hoped his ship would soon be set free. The Casco men convinced Captain Prindeville to allow them to attempt to reach shore. To assist them, the captain ordered a lifeboat launched. Although a heavy burden, the lifeboat was just the insurance the men needed as they made their way home, across the solid ice pack, which was now moving freely back toward the north. The ice did not loosen its grip, however, and the weather worsened. The Michigan drifted northward with the ice pack for another week. On Sunday, March 1, the steamer was seen locked in the ice 7 miles north of Casco. She was reported opposite Saugatuck on Wednesday. Newspapers were even speculating she would finally reach Grand Haven after a while. The shifting of the ice and the wind were beginning to take their toll on the hull. The pressure was incredible. Thursday, March 19, was the final day that the Michigan would remain in the icy grip of the big lake. She was breaking up, and Captain Prindeville had to consider abandoning ship. The ice had shifted again, and the immense pressure on the Michigan's hull was beginning to take a toll. The crew could hear the steel hull buckling throughout the night and all that next day. The 42-day battle was valiantly fought, but the ice was winning. It was only a matter of time. At a distance of about 4 miles, they spotted a tugboat. It was the Arctic, sent out to find the stranded steamer, but it too had become trapped in the ice. As the hull buckled and the ship showed every sign of succumbing to the ice, Captain Prindeville made the decision to abandon ship and to try to make for the safety of the tugboat. It was a very difficult decision to abandon his ship after a 42-day battle with the ice. With the ice running, the men again employed a lifeboat on their journey across the ice to the Arctic. But before they were more than a quarter mile away, the ice finally stove in the Michigan's hull. The vessel filled with water and went to the bottom in about 300 feet, according to local newspaper accounts. The Michigan's crew reached the Goodrich tug after a day-long battle with the ice and spent the next few days with the 4-member crew of the Arctic, waiting for the ice to relinquish its grip. But the Arctic crew had already been trapped in the ice for several days and were themselves desperately running short of provisions. Having used up all but the last few supplies, the Michigan crew again took to the ice and headed east toward the far-off shore early in the morning of Monday, March 23rd. Once again, the tug's crew was left alone to wait it out. After 42 days of inactivity, little food, and extreme cold, these last few miles were the toughest for the crew of the Michigan. Crew member Charles Robinson gave up during the long walk, and again, through the unusual stamina and strength of character of George Sheldon, was carried safely to shore. The crew touched solid land for the first time in 42 days, 7 miles north of Holland, after a 10 to 12 mile hike across the ice. Captain Prindeville and his remaining 12 crew members made it safely ashore just in time as the spring thaw began breaking up the ice. But thanks to the skill of the crew of the Michigan, the heroism of George Sheldon, and the decisive action of Captain Redmond Prindeville, all 30 men lived to tell their incredible story of patience, stamina, and heroism while icebound on Lake Michigan.
With a good understanding of the details surrounding the sinking of the Michigan, we began to develop a probable search area. Captain Prindeville had consistently reported his ship had gone down between 15 and 20 miles offshore, so that gave us a good idea of where to begin the search.
There were, however, newspaper accounts that complicated that simple assumption. Several newspapers reported on March 23rd, quote, "Early this morning they left the Arctic firmly packed in the ice with no prospects of getting free, and arrived at Holland this afternoon, and here via train to Grand Haven this evening," unquote. While MSRA could not be sure how far the Arctic was from shore, the train station was and still is 7 miles from Holland Harbor. If the crew left the Arctic at daybreak and reached the train station by 2 p.m., their trek was accomplished in only 7.5 hours.
Walking 10 to 15 miles over the ice and then another 7 miles on shore in just 7.5 hours seemed like an awfully tough feat for the crew. So I grabbed a stopwatch and my pocket GPS and went out to Lake Michigan on the ice and walked it myself. And the numbers I came up with were the crew would have a tough time sustaining a 2-mile-an-hour average over the walk, which means the Arctic would be much closer to shore, maybe only 8 miles offshore. Now, since the Michigan was within a few miles of the Arctic, we kind of were thinking the Michigan would be closer to shore and not so far out.
That speculation caused the team to increase the overall search area to over 60 square miles. Enter David Trotter. Since 1998, MSRA has been partnering with Mr. Trotter to search for shipwrecks off western Michigan. Utilizing his Klein side-scan sonar for 10 days each spring, Trotter provides the technology and the expertise to help solve local mysteries.
It's a device where you take a torpedo-like fish, as we call it, and drop it over the side, attached to cable, and has an array of electronics and crystals in it. And through the cable, the sound is sent back up to a recording device, and it's left up to an expert operator to interpret the printout that is coming out as a result of the fish moving through the water and mapping the bottom topography.
During the 2003 search expedition with David Trotter, MSRA set aside one day to begin exploration for the Michigan. and made several passes down the middle of the cone, connecting up to previous coverage completed in 1999. It was a good start. In 2004, MSRA spent 24 hours straight to continue the quest. Early that morning at about 3 a.m., Trotter noted an unusual target. In reviewing the side scan paper the next day, Trotter estimated the target at about 200 feet long. The darker than usual plot suggested a ship made of metal. The Michigan was 204 feet with a steel hull. Could it be that with so little effort, the Michigan had revealed herself? When weather allowed them to return to the lake to plot more detailed side scan images, their hopes were dashed.
You're talking about a rounded stern and a pointed forepeak or bow of a ship. I do not get that feeling out of this, I will tell you. I'm getting something more, quite frankly, that has bluff each side. Okay.
Several dives a few weeks later revealed a modern barge, probably scuttled for the insurance money. The Michigan would not give up her location so easily. With over 20 miles now covered and a scuttled barge located in the middle of the Michigan search cone, MSRA focused the 2005 search entirely on finding the Michigan. Additional research and strategizing with David Trotter over the winter helped them to develop a more defined search area, building upon prior year's coverage. Each quadrant represented what Trotter felt could be covered in one long day. The initial focus area would be closer to shore, based upon MSRA's belief that the Michigan's crew could not have reached the Holland train station by 2 p.m. if they were much further out. With good weather on their side, the team made incredible headway in just 4 days. After losing the next day to high winds and with half of the search time used up, the team turned to David Trotter to solicit his input on how to proceed. Trotter encouraged them to reread the news accounts and reconsider the significance of what Captain Prindiville had reported.
We began to consider the reliability of a seasoned captain like Redmond Prindiville. The captain certainly had plenty of time to take sightings on his position as the ship moved north with the ice. If he calculated his position was 15 to 20 miles offshore, he was probably not far off on his calculations.
But what of those newspapers that reported the crew reaching the train station in just over 7 hours?
All of the articles that reported the crew's final walk to shore were worded nearly identical. In rereading them, we caught something in one of the papers that suggested it had taken the crew 2 days to reach shore. Now, if this were true, the Michigan could certainly be as far as 20 miles offshore.
With those new insights and only 5 days remaining for the search, MSRA moved the search further offshore. Selecting which quadrant to work each day was critical, especially considering that the weather could take a turn for the worse, and any day could be their last. The next day out, the team covered an additional quadrant, but no Michigan. The following day, they covered still another quadrant, but still no Michigan. By this point, they had covered 40 square miles. With only 2 search days remaining if the weather held, they headed west into waters over 300 feet deep. Still no Michigan. On their final search day, 3 quadrants still remained.
Because of some mechanical difficulties that occurred the day before, I spent Sunday morning making repairs to the boat, and by the time it was ready, it was noon. Our only feasible option was to search in the quadrant nearest to shore, because we weren't going to have much time that day.
It was 2 p.m. on June 11th when we finally reached the starting point for our first run of the day. I was piloting the boat and began the first 4-mile run to the west, going parallel to the quadrant we ran the previous day. Just before I was ready to make the turn into the next run, Dave called from below, asking me to come about and run the same line again.
A small oddity on the paper had caught Trotter's attention. It was directly below the boat, and so the image was unclear. But the next pass provided more detail.
We have a target. After 10 days and 50 square miles, we have now located what we believe to be the SS Michigan.
Hopes were higher this time. This was surely not a barge, but only a closer look at the wreck could confirm its identity. MSRA linked up with local technical divers who provided the skills and equipment required to make a dive to this depth and the experience necessary to document and identify the wreck. Holland, Michigan business owner Jeff Voss and Bob Underhill, a Kalamazoo, Michigan electrical engineer, had previously worked with MSRA on other deep discoveries. Joining the team was MSRA sustaining member Todd White, a Saugatuck restaurant owner and technical diver. While the MSRA board are all divers, none are trained for the kind of depth presented by this wreck. Less than a week after the discovery, the team returned to the site to begin exploration of the wreck in an attempt to make a positive identification. Working with Valerie Van Heest, the dive team reviewed the blueprints of the Michigan to help in identifying the wreck. If the wreck was the Michigan, the team felt it would be considerably more intact than a ship that went down in stormy seas. Assuming the Michigan was damaged mostly below the waterline, it was expected the upper works, including the pilot house and passenger cabins, might be intact.
The goal is to swim around the perimeter and videotape all the way around the wreck in the upper decks and look for a name board, which from pictures we have is at near the stern. And then if we see something interesting, we'll hover around that area. Whatever's left, if they're cabins or pilot house or a smokestack, that'd be of good interest.
I first read about the Michigan and red stacks over the horizon in the 1970s. I tried to get my club to come look for it. Of course, everybody at that time said it was too deep, which in fact it is. In the 70s it was too deep. It's not too deep anymore, thanks to mixed gas technology. So this is probably the one wreck that I have always wanted to dive. I have had trouble sleeping since you told me you found it last week.
Yeah, it's very exciting to be one of the first to ever see something that's been on the bottom of the lake for over 100 years. This will be the first time I got to be the first diver on a wreck.
It will be a long, cold, and strenuous dive for these men. They take their time to suit up, do a last-minute check on their gas mixtures, and don their gear. As the divers disappear beneath the surface, they leave behind their spouses and the MSRA team to anxiously await their return.
It's 2:45 and the divers have just entered the water. They're going to take about 3 or 4 minutes getting to the bottom, and they're going to spend 20 minutes covering the deck area. They're going to be down at about 250 feet of water, and we expect them to take about 60 minutes of decompression time to return to the surface. And at that point, in about an hour and a quarter, we're going to have a better idea of what we've found here on the bottom of Lake Michigan.
Using information from the side scan image, MSRA was able to set the anchor line to bring the divers down near the stern. But little else is known of what they might encounter. It would be up to the dive team to search for clues that might help in identifying the ship. Although they are an environmental nuisance, the zebra mussel infestation, which began in the Great Lakes in the 1990s, has been both good and bad for divers. As filter feeders, the mussels have helped improve visibility, but they have begun to obscure the wrecks as they cluster on wood and metal surfaces. While in the 1980s it would have been pitch black at only 100 feet deep, the dive team could see the outline of this 275-foot deep wreck from about 220 feet, and still had ambient light at the bottom. Arriving at the stern, they immediately noticed a buildup of sediment on the aft deck, suggesting a hard impact with the bottom. Nearby, a smokestack lay toppled. The Michigan single stack was located towards the stern, so this was a good initial clue. However, there appeared to be a lot of damage, broken timbers, fallen structures, and the severe bend of the smokestack, all suggesting violence beyond what it was imagined that the Michigan encountered. Setting off to follow the port rail, the divers made their way forward to explore the ship. Not far from the stern, Voss found the name board just where the Michigan's plans indicated. However, it was coated with zebra mussels. Scraping the mussels off with his mitt would not reveal the identity. All the paint was gone, possibly sandblasted off the plaque by the action of the ever-moving silt. Dropping down the side below the main deck, White found a side cargo door open and peered inside. He could see all the way through to the other side, where the opposite door was also open. The cargo deck appeared to be a large open void, which was another clue as to the identity. Because the Michigan was on a rescue mission, it was carrying no cargo. Heading forward, the team realized that the damage seen at the stern continued the length of the vessel. If this was the Michigan, the upper works had collapsed onto the main deck. As they approached the bow, something seemed to be taking shape. The ship's wheel, a double configuration, loomed into view. Nothing MSRA had read about the Michigan, nor its plans, indicated that it had been equipped with a double wheel, used to provide additional leverage in high seas. It appeared that the pilot house had collapsed around the helm, leaving the wheel untouched and neatly exposed on the deck. Just forward of the wheel, White recognized the capstan, which he realized would hold the key to the identity of the ship. All capstan covers were engraved with the name of the vessel and city of origin. Passing over it, he saw that it was completely covered in zebra mussels. He took a few minutes to examine the nearby anchors, while Underhill attacked the mussel buildup. Since the Michigan was firmly entrenched in the ice and had no need to use the anchors, the fact that these two woodstocks rested in their secured position was a good sign that MSRA had found the right ship. So far, most of the features they had seen pointed to the Michigan, but the capstan would provide the absolute proof. As White brushed the remaining silt off the cover, the letters began to appear. He could make out the letters M-I-C-H, and below it read Wyandotte, Michigan, its place of manufacture. Finally, there was no doubt about the identity of this ship. With bottom time almost used up, Voss, Underhill, and White returned to the stern and began their decompression. MSRA would have to wait another hour to hear the good news. The divers initially had pumped argon, a dense gas, into their dry suits. This provided the warmth they would need to withstand another hour in the water. Monitoring their computers, they slowly ascended with stops along the way. At about 100 feet, they switched over to nitrox, and then at 20 feet, they spent the balance of their decompression using oxygen.
That's it. That's the Michigan. Beat up.
Beat up?
Yep. Not near as good condition as what I'd hoped.
A few minutes behind Voss, White returned.
Woo! What a dive! Great visibility. Hull's all intact, sitting upright. Anchors on the bow.
The initial identifying dive made by Voss, Underhill, and White was an amazing accomplishment considering the extreme depth of the dive. But what would be even more amazing were the future dives, when they would begin to explore the interior of the wreck. Studying the original construction drawings and comparing it to their video of the wreck, the team realized that the wreck had sunk into the bottom mud up to her waterline. The hull is in one piece, and the upper structures are still on the wreck, but the pilot house, cabins, and smokestack have collapsed onto the deck. They all lay fallen towards the port side stern, indicating that the initial impact on the bottom caused a massive collapse. Had the joints waterlogged and decayed over time, the structures would have fallen more haphazardly. There are several cargo hatches and doors that are open to the interior. Over the next several visits, the divers became more familiar with the layout of the wreck and opted to venture inside. Curious what he might find down the stairwell on the port side near the capstan, White negotiated the narrow opening where he came upon the windlass used to raise and lower the anchors. A small opening and ladder in the floor led down into the chain locker. Looking around, he could see the corridor leading aft to the galley and cargo area. On the forward stanchion post, he discovered 2 plaques. Upon closer inspection, he could see that they indicated the builder of the windlass, the American Windlass Company in Providence, Rhode Island, and the date of its patent. Guided by several resident Burbits, calling the Michigan their home, White headed topside. Having established a mooring near the down smokestack, Voss dedicated one dive to locating the galley. Making his way inside through cargo door 3 on the port side, Voss entered the void that would have been the cargo deck. Inside the ship, he could make out 3 cargo openings into the lowest deck, each with a winch used to lower cargo below. While there was no cargo, the inside was littered with hand trucks, wheelbarrows, and some pieces of furniture. Near the galley, the base of the mast became apparent. As he reached the galley, he could see an open doorway, but he also noted that the aft wall had collapsed outward, so he could enter the room over the top of the wall. Voss was surprised to find some white porcelain dishes still on the wall racks, possibly put away after the crew's last dinner on board their ship. The other dishes had fallen to the floor amid a foot-deep buildup of silt. White, who was videotaping this penetration, panned his camera across the hall to find the door to the crew's mess and berths off its hinges, blocking passage to that room. Meanwhile, Underhill began exploration of the stern compartments, entering through the aftmost cargo door on the port side just below the fallen stack. Just behind the engine were a series of 4 rooms, all connected via the main passageway. Underhill made his way through the passageway. To the right, a hall led back to the gear room, where the top of the rudder mechanism was located, but going to the very stern would have to wait for another dive. He continued into the passageway where he encountered a bell that would have been used by the pilot to transmit orders to the engine crew. Wires were still connected to the bell, presumably forward to the pilot house. To his right, he found a door invitingly open. Inside, he discovered 7 oil signal lanterns stacked neatly in their rack. And below them, an oiler a foot deep in the muck used for filling the lanterns. On a workbench were the remnants of several other oil lanterns. A friendly Burbot was surprised to find the lantern room actually illuminated after all the years of total blackness. Backing out of the lantern room, Underhill proceeded to the next compartment that the blueprints indicated were the crew's quarters. An oil lantern mounted on the wall was missing its glass shade. Along the starboard outer hall, Underhill found a pile of wood. Cleaning off a plank, he discovered the letters S3. He speculated that this might have been a signpost labeling the third cargo door on the starboard side, but it was nowhere near that hatch. Perhaps the crew had gathered miscellaneous pieces of wood to burn for heat during their last few days on board the ship. Underhill swiveled around to take a look at the portion of engine visible from this main cargo deck. The red paint on the engine was still visible after over 120 years underwater. It was in such good condition that it seemed, with a little grease, it could run again. At that point, it was time to head back to the surface. Respecting the ship and its artifacts as a time capsule that represents the ordeal that the Michigan and its crew endured, the divers left everything as they had found it. Just before the cold winds of November would make further visits to the Michigan impossible, divers Underhill, Voss, and White made their last dive of the season. Each feature of the wreck evidenced everything they had come to know about the Michigan's last voyage. What had begun as a simple rescue mission ended with this magnificent ship going to the bottom. From the moment the captain signaled the Michigan's peril on the steam whistle, he fought heroically to save his ship, but to no avail. The crew maintained a regular routine for over a month, as they waited for the weather to shift and free them. But instead, it pulled the ship down in its icy grip. When Captain Prindiville finally gave the order to abandon ship, realizing his efforts to save the Michigan had failed, he knew the fate of his vessel. Unlashing the last lifeboat was the only way to save the crew, and now the empty lifeboat davit will forever be a reminder that while the ship was a victim, all 30 men survived. Leaving the Michigan was probably the hardest thing Prindiville had to do, knowing what would become of his ship. After the Michigan sank, the Arctic remained trapped for many more days. Captain Kirby, owner of the stout vessel, sent a relief party out to the tug with 150 pounds of flour, pork, and other provisions. In command of this relief party was none other than George Sheldon, the hero of the SS Michigan. Within a few days, the ice began breaking up, and the Arctic steamed home safely. Unbelievably, the Oneida had actually worked herself out of the ice later on the very same day the Michigan had set out to her rescue. If technology had been more advanced at that time, ship-to-shore communications could have prevented this unnecessary and costly expedition. The brave and hardy George Sheldon lived only another 5 years, passing away in 1890 in Mount Clemens, Michigan, where he had gone to partake in the mineral baths. Captain Prindiville sailed a few more years, then settled into a more peaceful life as an insurance agent in Chicago, living to the age of 87. He and his family were interred at Chicago's Calvary Cemetery, marked by this unusual boulder with the family name inscribed. Unlike Shackleton's vessel Endurance, which has not yet been discovered, the Michigan's remains have now been uncovered, and the final chapter written. The story of the SS Michigan is a reminder of the perseverance, stamina, and heroism of her crew. It's also a reminder of what can be accomplished when we take Ernest Shackleton's words to heart and believe that difficulties are just things to overcome after all.